The phone rang at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning, and I knew before I even looked at the caller ID that this was going to complicate my life. Sarah's name flashed on the screen, and my stomach dropped. My cousin hadn't called me in over 2 years, not since I'd cut all contact with my father's side of the family. But there she was, her voice bright and cheerful, as she launched into a story about her daughter Emma's upcoming 8th birthday party. Everything seemed normal until she mentioned how much little Emma missed Uncle David and suggested it would be healing for everyone if the whole family could finally come together again. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't an innocent birthday invitation. This was an ambush carefully orchestrated by my father's relatives to force a reconciliation after 3 years of blessed silence, following my decision to permanently sever ties with David and his web of emotional and financial destruction. Sarah's voice carried that particular tone I remembered from childhood, the one that meant she thought she was being helpful while completely missing the point. She rattled on about family unity and healing old wounds, but all I could hear was the careful orchestration behind her words. Someone had coached her on this conversation. Let me back up and explain why that phone call felt like a knife twisting in my chest. 3 years ago, I made the hardest decision of my life. I cut all contact with my father David after watching him systematically destroy my mother through 15 years of marriage. The man had turned emotional manipulation into an art form, convincing everyone around him that his victims were the real problem. My name is Artemis, and at 28 I work as an accountant here in Denver. It took me years to understand that what I witnessed growing up wasn't normal family dysfunction. David had spent my entire childhood gaslighting my mother Linda, making her question her own sanity, while he controlled every aspect of our household finances and social connections. The breaking point came during their divorce proceedings. David had been having an affair with his secretary Patricia for 2 years, but when Mom finally discovered the truth and filed for divorce, he flipped the narrative completely. Suddenly, according to David, Mom was the unstable one. She was mentally unhinged, financially irresponsible, and turning me against my own father out of spite. David spread these lies throughout our extended family with surgical precision. He painted himself as the long-suffering husband who had tried everything to save his marriage to a woman who refused help for her supposed mental health issues. He claimed Mom had hidden debts and made poor financial decisions that forced him to take control of their accounts for the family's protection. The truth was exactly the opposite. Mom worked double shifts as a registered nurse to support our family, while David bounced between sales jobs, always blaming external factors when his ventures failed. She managed our household budget with the skill of a professional accountant, stretching every dollar to cover David's impulsive purchases and failed business schemes. But David was charismatic. He could convince anyone of anything when he put his mind to it. By the time the divorce was finalized, most of his family believed his version of events. They saw Mom as the villain who had broken up a good man's family and turned his son against him. The reality was that David left Mom with almost nothing. Through legal maneuvering and hidden assets, he walked away from 15 years of marriage with the house, most of their savings, and his reputation intact. Mom moved into a small apartment and picked up a second job at a clinic just to make ends meet. Meanwhile, David moved his new wife, Patricia, into the suburban home where I'd grown up, and they settled into their comfortable life built on the wreckage of my mother's financial security. I chose Mom. Not because she turned me against David, but because I had eyes and a functioning brain. I'd watched him tear her down for years, and I wasn't going to pretend his behavior was acceptable just because we shared DNA. That decision cost me relationships with cousins, aunts, and uncles who believed David's carefully crafted narrative. For 3 years, I'd lived with the peace that came from removing toxic people from my life, even when those people were family. Now Sarah was on the phone cheerfully explaining how little Emma had been asking about Uncle David, and wouldn't it be wonderful if everyone could put aside their differences for a child's birthday celebration? The thing is, Artemis, Sarah continued. Emma specifically asked if Uncle David could come to her party. She says she misses him and doesn't understand why the family doesn't get together anymore. Patricia thought it might be a good opportunity for everyone to start healing. There it was. Patricia's name dropped casually into the conversation like a breadcrumb leading back to the real architects of this plan. Sarah wasn't organizing a reconciliation out of concern for family unity. She was being used as a messenger by David and his wife, who had clearly been working on this scheme for some time. "Sarah," I said carefully, "when exactly did Emma ask about David, and how did Patricia hear about it?" There was a brief pause, the kind that happens when someone realizes they've said more than they intended. "Well, Patricia and I were talking last week about the party planning, and I mentioned how Emma always asks about family members at these events. Patricia said it was sad that David felt so shut out from the family, especially since he's tried so hard to reach out over the years." My grip tightened on the phone. "He's tried to reach out." "Oh yes, he's sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, but apparently they keep getting returned. Patricia says David is heartbroken that you and Linda won't even acknowledge his attempts at reconciliation. She thinks maybe if you saw how much the extended family misses having everyone together, you might be willing to give him another chance." The audacity was breathtaking. David hadn't sent a single card gift or message in 3 years. I would have known because I handled all of Mom's mail during her recovery from the emotional devastation of the divorce. Patricia was lying with the confidence of someone who knew her audience wanted to believe her. But the most chilling part was the revelation that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment idea. Patricia and David had been laying groundwork for months, feeding information to family members and painting themselves as the wronged parties who desperately wanted reconciliation. They had convinced an 8-year-old child to ask for Uncle David at her birthday party, turning little Emma into an unwitting weapon in their manipulation campaign. Sarah was still talking, explaining the party details and expressing hope that this could be a new beginning for everyone. But I was no longer listening to her words. I was hearing the calculated orchestration behind them, recognizing the familiar pattern of David's manipulation tactics. He hadn't changed. He had simply found new ways to control the narrative and new people to help him do it. After hanging up with Sarah, I sat in my kitchen staring at my coffee cup and trying to process what had just happened. The smart thing would be to politely decline the invitation and maintain the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. But something about the calculated nature of their plan made my blood boil. They weren't just trying to force a reconciliation. They were systematically rewriting history and using my innocent cousin as a puppet in their scheme. If I didn't show up, they would use my absence as further proof that I was the unreasonable one keeping the family apart. I decided I needed intelligence before making any decisions. If David and Patricia were spreading lies about the past 3 years, I wanted to know exactly what story they'd been telling. My first call was to my Aunt Margaret, David's older sister. Margaret had always been direct and honest, which made her both an easy target for manipulation and a reliable source of information once she trusted you. "Margaret," I said, keeping my voice casual. "Sarah mentioned that Emma wants the whole family at her birthday party. I've been thinking lately that maybe it's time to put the past behind us." The relief in Margaret's voice was immediate and heartbreaking. "Oh, Artemis, I'm so glad to hear you say that. David has been hoping for this day for so long. He talks about you constantly wondering how you're doing and wishing he could be part of your life again. Really, he talks about me all the time. He shows us every birthday card and Christmas gift he's tried to send, but they always come back unopened. Patricia says your mother must be intercepting them, but David refuses to give up hope. He keeps saying that someday you'll realize how much he loves you and wants to make things right." My stomach churned as Margaret continued describing David's supposed efforts to reconnect. According to her, he had been sending gifts and cards, religiously calling my old phone number regularly, and even driving by my apartment complex hoping to run into me accidentally. None of this was true. David didn't even have my current address or phone number. But Margaret believed every word because the story fit her understanding of family dynamics. David was the loving father trying to reconnect with his stubborn son, while Linda was the bitter ex-wife poisoning that relationship out of spite. "What exactly has Patricia told you about the divorce?" I asked. Margaret's tone shifted to something between pity and frustration. "Artemis, I know Linda is your mother and you love her, but she really needs professional help. The gambling addiction destroyed her judgment, and David tried everything to save their marriage. He even offered to pay for counseling, but she refused. Patricia says Linda convinced you that David was the problem to avoid taking responsibility for her own issues. Gambling addiction. That was a new detail in their fabricated narrative. Mom had never gambled beyond buying an occasional lottery ticket at the grocery store, but it was a perfect accusation because it explained away David's financial control and justified his decision to leave the marriage. Did David tell you about Linda's gambling himself, or did you hear it from Patricia? Well, Patricia explained most of it. David gets too emotional talking about that period. Patricia says he still blames himself for not recognizing the signs sooner. She's been such a blessing for him, helping him heal from all that trauma. After 20 minutes of listening to Margaret repeat Patricia's carefully constructed lies, I thanked her and hung up. Then I called my uncle, Tom, David's younger brother. Tom's version of events included additional details that Patricia had clearly customized for his personality. Since Tom was practical and business-minded, Patricia had emphasized the financial aspects of Linda's supposed problems. According to Tom, Linda had hidden credit card debts and made unauthorized withdrawals from their savings account to fund her gambling. David tried to work with her. Tom explained, but she was spending money faster than he could earn it. Patricia helped him realize he had to protect himself legally or lose everything he'd worked for. The sophistication of their campaign was impressive in its evil. Patricia hadn't just created a general narrative about Linda being unstable. She had crafted specific versions of the story tailored to appeal to each family member's concerns and biases. Margaret, who valued family unity above all else, heard about David's heartbreak and desperate attempts at reconciliation. Tom, who worried about financial security, heard about Linda's reckless spending and David's responsible decision to protect his assets. I realized I needed documentation to counter their lies. The next morning, I called Mom's divorce attorney and requested copies of all the financial records from their proceedings. What I discovered made me sick with rage. Far from hiding debts or gambling away their savings, Mom had been the one protecting their family's financial interests. The records showed that David had opened secret credit cards, taken loans against their house without Mom's knowledge, and funneled money into failed business ventures while telling her their savings were earning interest in certificates of deposit. When Mom discovered the truth during the divorce investigation, David had already moved most of their liquid assets into accounts with Patricia's name attached. The legal system moved too slowly to prevent this theft, and by the time Mom's attorney could take action, the money was hidden behind multiple business entities and shell companies. David had portrayed Mom as financially irresponsible while systematically stealing from her for years. But the most damning evidence came from a source I hadn't expected. While reviewing the financial documents, I noticed several payments to a private investigator. When I called Mom's attorney to ask about this, he explained that they had hired the investigator to track David's hidden assets. "Your father is extremely sophisticated in his financial manipulation," the attorney told me. "Our investigator found evidence that he'd used similar tactics in previous relationships, but we couldn't introduce that information in court because it wasn't directly relevant to your mother's case." Previous relationships. David had been married before Mom, something I'd never known. The investigator had found records of another woman who had been left financially devastated after David disappeared from her life. I asked for the investigator's contact information and called him that afternoon. What I learned shattered my understanding of who my father really was. David's pattern went back decades. He would target women who had some financial resources or earning potential, charm them into marriage, gradually take control of their finances, and then disappear when he'd extracted everything valuable from the relationship. He left behind broken families and devastated women who were too ashamed to warn others about his methods. The investigator had found evidence of at least 3 previous marriages that followed this exact pattern. David wasn't just an abusive husband who happened to be good at manipulation. He was a career predator who used marriage as a vehicle for financial fraud. And Patricia wasn't just his new wife. She was his partner in this ongoing criminal enterprise. There's something else, the investigator told me. Patricia has her own history of financial crimes. She was fired from 2 previous jobs for embezzling, though the companies didn't press charges to avoid negative publicity. She and your father make quite a team. As I hung up the phone, I felt like I was looking at my family history through a completely different lens. David hadn't been a flawed man who made bad choices during a difficult divorce. He was a professional con artist who had been destroying families for decades. And now he and Patricia were trying to gain access to our extended family's resources by painting themselves as the victims of my mother's mental illness and my misguided loyalty. That night I sat in my apartment surrounded by financial documents and investigative reports, trying to decide what to do with this information. I could simply share it with Margaret and Tom, proving that David and Patricia were lying about everything. But something told me that wouldn't be enough. People who had invested 3 years in believing a particular narrative wouldn't abandon it easily, especially when confronting the truth meant acknowledging they had been deceived and had inadvertently enabled abuse. I needed a strategy that would force David and Patricia to expose themselves, rather than simply challenging their lies with competing evidence. That's when I decided to attend Emma's birthday party after all. Not to reconcile with David, but to give him enough rope to hang himself with his own deceptions. I was going to let my father dig his own grave in front of the entire family, using his own arrogance and Patricia's greed as the shovels. The next morning I called my cousin Jake, Sarah's older brother, who had always been the most level-headed person in our extended family. Jake was 32, worked as an engineer, and had a reputation for thinking things through before acting. If anyone in the family might be open to hearing uncomfortable truths, it would be him. Jake, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. What exactly has David told everyone about why Mom and I don't speak to him anymore? There was a long pause before Jake answered. Artemis, this is probably going to be hard to hear, but the family thinks Linda had some serious problems that she wouldn't get help for. David says he tried everything to save their marriage, but she wouldn't admit she needed professional support. What kind of problems specifically? Gambling mainly, and some mental health issues that made her paranoid about David's motives. Patricia explained that Linda convinced you David was hiding money when he was actually trying to protect their assets from her impulsive spending. I let that sink in for a moment. Jake, in all the years you've known my mother, have you ever seen any evidence that she gambles or has mental health problems? Another pause, longer this time. Actually, that's something I've been wondering about. Linda always seemed like one of the most stable, responsible people I knew. But David and Patricia have been so consistent in their story, and they seem genuinely hurt by the situation. What if I told you I have documentation proving that everything they've told you is a lie? I'd want to see that documentation. Jake's willingness to consider alternative explanations gave me hope. Over the next hour, I walked him through the financial records and the investigator's findings. I watched his expression change from skepticism to confusion to anger as the evidence mounted. "This is insane," he said finally. "Are you telling me David has been running some kind of long-term con on multiple families?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And Patricia isn't an innocent woman who fell in love with the wrong man. She's his partner in this whole operation." Jake studied the documents for several more minutes before looking up at me. "If this is all true, then the family has been unknowingly supporting a pair of criminals for 3 years. We've been helping them maintain their cover story. Worse than that, I think they've been using the family for more than just credibility." "What do you mean?" "Think about it, Jake. Have David and Patricia ever asked family members for money, small amounts, nothing that would raise suspicion individually?" Jake's face went pale. "Last year, David asked if I could loan him $1,500 for legal fees related to some business dispute. He said it was temporary, just until some investments matured. I gave it to him because family helps. Family, you know. Did he pay you back?" He said the legal situation got more complicated and he needed to put all his available cash toward attorney fees, but he promised to pay me back as soon as everything was settled. Have you seen any evidence that he's actually dealing with legal problems? Jake was quiet for a long moment. No. In fact, he and Patricia took a vacation to Hawaii 3 months after I gave him that money. Patricia posted pictures all over social media of them staying at some resort that must have cost thousands. Jake, I think they've been systematically borrowing money from different family members using the same story. Have you heard anyone else mention loaning David money for various emergencies or legal fees? Actually, yes. Sarah mentioned that David needed help with some unexpected medical bills for Patricia's mother, and I think Tom gave him money for car repairs at some point. We spent the rest of the afternoon calling other family members, carefully asking questions about any financial assistance they might have provided to David and Patricia. The pattern that emerged was sophisticated and chilling. Over the past 2 years, David and Patricia had approached virtually every adult family member with requests for small loans ranging from $500 to $2,000. Each request came with a different emergency explanation: legal fees, medical bills, car repairs, temporary business setbacks, unexpected tax obligations. None of the loans had been repaid, and when family members asked about repayment, David would become emotional and explain how difficult it was to get back on his feet while dealing with the ongoing trauma of being estranged from his son. "They've been using our guilt about the family situation to rob us," Jake said. "They've probably collected $15,000 or $20,000 from the family over the past 2 years. And that's just what we know about. There might be other family members who haven't mentioned giving them money." Jake was getting angrier by the minute. "So what do we do? Confront them at Emma's party and ruin a little girl's birthday? What?" "Actually, I have a better idea. What if we let them expose themselves?" I explained my plan. We would attend the party and encourage David and Patricia to repeat their lies about the past in front of as many family members as possible. We'd ask innocent questions that prompted them to elaborate on their fictional narrative while secretly recording their statements. Meanwhile, Jake would quietly share some of the financial evidence with Margaret and Tom, letting them see for themselves how their trust had been exploited. "The goal isn't to humiliate them in front of Emma," I explained. "It's to give them enough confidence to hang themselves with their own lies while the whole family watches." Jake was on board, but he had concerns about Sarah's role in the situation. What if Sarah is knowingly helping them? What if this birthday party idea was her contribution to their manipulation campaign? That possibility had been bothering me as well. Sarah had always been sweet and trusting, but she was also struggling financially as a single mother working 2 jobs. If David and Patricia had been pressuring her for money, she might have organized the reconciliation attempt, hoping it would relieve that pressure. We decided that Jake would talk to his sister privately before the party to determine whether she was a willing participant or another victim. That evening, Jake called me with disturbing news from his conversation with Sarah. She broke down and admitted that David and Patricia have been asking her for money every few months, he told me. They convinced her that they needed help with legal fees to fight false accusations Linda had made during the divorce. Sarah felt terrible that David's own family wasn't supporting him during such a difficult time. How much money has she given them? Over $3,000 in the past year. Money she couldn't afford to lose. She's been working overtime shifts just to keep up with her own bills, but she kept giving the money because Patricia convinced her it was temporary and that David would pay everyone back once his legal situation was resolved. So the birthday party reconciliation was Sarah's desperate attempt to end the ongoing financial pressure. She hoped that if you and David reconciled, he'd stop asking family members for money to fight his legal battles against Linda's supposed lies. Sarah wasn't complicit in their manipulation. She was another victim who had been systematically exploited and was trying to solve the problem the only way she knew how. "There's something else," Jake continued. "When I told Sarah about the evidence we'd gathered, she mentioned that Patricia has been dropping hints about financial problems with the nonprofit where she works. Apparently there's been some kind of audit, and Patricia has been stressed about accounting discrepancies. An audit of Patricia's workplace. Combined with the investigator's information about her history of embezzlement, this suggested that Patricia and David's criminal activities extended beyond family manipulation. Jake, I think we need to expand our investigation before the party. If Patricia is embezzling from her current employer, that gives us leverage we can use to protect the family. What kind of leverage? The kind that makes criminals think twice about continuing their operations when they realize they're about to be exposed on multiple fronts. The next day, I called the investigator who had worked on Mom's divorce case and asked him to look into Patricia's current employment situation. What he found exceeded my worst expectations. Patricia worked as treasurer for a small nonprofit that provided meals to elderly residents in low-income housing. The organization's annual budget was only about $200,000, but Patricia had access to all their accounts and handled their financial reporting. The investigators' preliminary research suggested that approximately $30,000 had gone missing from the nonprofit's accounts over the past 18 months. The missing money had been funneled through false expense reports and phantom vendor payments, then moved into personal accounts controlled by Patricia. The audit is being conducted by the State Attorney General's office, the investigator explained. This isn't just internal bookkeeping problems. This is a criminal investigation. Patricia and David weren't just manipulating our family for small loans. Patricia was stealing money from an organization that fed hungry elderly people, and they were using their family connections to establish credibility while conducting multiple criminal enterprises. I realized that attending Emma's party wasn't just about exposing their lies to our relatives. It was about stopping active criminals who were harming vulnerable people while using our family name and relationships as cover for their operations. The stakes had just gotten much higher, and I was no longer planning a simple confrontation. I was preparing to end their criminal careers entirely. I called Jake early the next morning with updates from the investigator's research. His reaction was immediate and intense. They're stealing from old people who can barely afford food. That's beyond family drama. That's sociopathic. And they've been using our family's credibility to maintain their cover while they operate. Every time someone asks about their financial situation, they point to David's tragic estrangement from his family as an explanation for their struggles. So what's our next move? We're going to coordinate with Sarah and make sure this birthday party becomes the end of their operation, rather than the beginning of deeper family manipulation. That afternoon, the three of us met at a coffee shop near Sarah's workplace. When Jake had told his sister about Patricia's embezzlement and David's pattern of fraud, Sarah had been devastated. "I can't believe I helped them," she kept saying. "I gave them money that Emma needed for school clothes because I thought David was being persecuted by Linda's false accusations." "Sarah, you're not responsible for their crimes," I told her. "They're professional manipulators who have been perfecting these techniques for decades. The fact that you wanted to help family members in crisis shows your character, not your weakness." "But what do we do now? They're expecting me to host this reconciliation party, and I've already invited the extended family. If I cancel suddenly, they'll know something is wrong." "We don't cancel," Jake said. "We use the party to expose them properly." I laid out our refined strategy. Sarah would proceed with the party as planned, but we would coordinate to ensure David and Patricia incriminated themselves thoroughly. Sarah would ask leading questions about their financial struggles and legal battles, encouraging them to repeat their lies about Linda's gambling and mental health problems. Meanwhile, Jake and I would privately brief Margaret and Tom about the evidence we'd gathered, giving them context to understand what they were hearing. The goal is to let them destroy their own credibility rather than us attacking them directly, I explained. When they realize the family knows the truth about their lies, they'll panic and make even bigger mistakes. Sarah was nervous about the deception involved, but she understood that protecting the rest of the family required exposing David and Patricia's ongoing crimes. What if they become threatening when they realize they've been caught? "That's actually what we want," Jake said. "If they drop their victim act and show their true nature, it will make it easier for everyone to see what we've been dealing with." 2 days before the party, I received an unexpected phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but the words hit me like a physical blow. "Is this Artemis?" My name is Michael, and I believe David is my father, too. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I'm sorry, what did you say? I've been looking for David for 15 years. I hired a private investigator who found evidence that he married your mother after abandoning my family. I think we're half-brothers. My legs felt weak, and I had to sit down. Tell me everything. Michael's story was hauntingly familiar. 25 years ago, when I was 3 years old, David had been married to a woman named Carol. They had a son, Michael, who was now 28 years old, just like me. David left when I was 13, Michael explained. One day, he just disappeared. Mom came home from work and found a note saying he needed to start over somewhere new. He cleaned out their bank accounts and took everything valuable from the house. How did you find me? The investigator tracked David through employment records and marriage licenses. When I learned he'd married Linda and had another son, I realized there might be other families out there. Then Mom told me something that made me think your family might have gone through the same thing we did. What did she tell you? That before David left us, he started talking about Linda constantly. He'd met her at some business conference and kept mentioning how successful she was as a nurse, how responsible she was with money. Mom thinks now that David was already planning his next target before he abandoned us. The pattern was even more systematic than I'd realized. David hadn't just moved from one relationship to another. He'd been carefully selecting his victims based on their financial resources and stability, using his current relationship as a base of operations while he researched and cultivated his next target. Michael, there's something you need to know about David's current situation. I spent an hour explaining David's marriage to Patricia, their ongoing manipulation of our extended family, and the evidence we'd gathered about their criminal activities. Michael listened with growing anger and recognition. He's still doing it, Michael said finally. 25 years later, he's still destroying families and stealing from people who trust him. Where are you now? And do you have any evidence from what happened to your family? I'm in Phoenix, but I can drive to Denver if you think it would help. And yes, I have evidence. Mom saved everything from their divorce proceedings, including financial records that show how David hid their assets before disappearing. Michael, we're planning to expose David and Patricia at a family gathering this weekend. If you could be there with your evidence, it would prove that this isn't just a misunderstanding between David and Linda. It would show that he's been doing this his entire adult life. I'll drive up tomorrow. But Artemis, there's something else you should know. Mom hired her own investigator a few years ago to track David's activities. She was hoping to find evidence that could help other families avoid what happened to us. What did the investigator find? That David and Patricia have been operating in multiple states using the same pattern. They target communities through churches or civic organizations, build credibility through volunteer work or business connections, and then systematically exploit the trust of people in those communities. Are there other families? At least 3 that the investigator could document. David seems to maintain multiple identities and moves between different areas when one location becomes too risky. The scope of David and Patricia's criminal enterprise was staggering. They weren't just opportunistic family manipulators. They were career criminals running sophisticated fraud operations across multiple states. Michael, when you come to Denver, bring everything you have. We're not just exposing them to our family anymore. We're building a case that could stop them from hurting anyone else. I'll be there Friday afternoon. And Artemis, thank you for not hanging up on me. I wasn't sure you'd believe me or want to get involved. We're brothers, I told him. David tried to destroy both our families, but he also connected us. Maybe it's time we use that connection to make sure he can't hurt anyone else. After hanging up with Michael, I called Jake and Sarah to update them on this development. The revelation that David had abandoned a previous family using identical tactics transformed our understanding of what we were dealing with. This isn't just about protecting our family, Sarah said. This is about stopping criminals who have been destroying lives for decades. And Michael's evidence proves that David's pattern goes back to before he met your mother, Jake added. This completely destroys their narrative about Linda causing the problems in their marriage. More than that, I said. When Michael shows up at the party with documentation of David's previous abandonment, it will prove that David is a career predator who has never had any intention of being a genuine father or husband to anyone. We adjusted our plan to include Michael's participation. His arrival at the party would serve as the final piece of evidence that David and Patricia were professional criminals, rather than victims of family misunderstandings. Saturday was going to be more than a birthday party. It was going to be the day that David and Patricia's criminal careers came to an end. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes Denver beautiful. I drove to Sarah's house with a mixture of nervous energy and grim determination. In my car were copies of financial documents, investigative reports, and a small digital recorder that would capture whatever David and Patricia said during the party. Michael had arrived the previous evening and we'd spent hours comparing notes and evidence. Seeing him was like looking into a distorted mirror. We shared enough physical features to clearly be related, but 15 years of wondering about his missing father had given him a weariness that I recognized from my own struggles with David's manipulation. "Are you ready for this?" he asked as we walked up to Sarah's front door. "I've been ready for 3 years," I told him. "But having you here changes everything. Now we're not just defending our family, we're representing all of David's victims." Sarah's house was already full of relatives when we arrived. Emma was running around in a pink birthday dress, genuinely excited about her party and blissfully unaware that her celebration was about to become the setting for a family reckoning. David and Patricia were holding court in the living room surrounded by Margaret, Tom, and several other relatives I hadn't seen in years. David looked comfortable and confident, the picture of a loving grandfather who was grateful to be included in family celebrations again. Patricia stood beside him wearing an expensive dress and jewelry that seemed inconsistent with their supposed financial struggles. "Artemis." David's voice boomed across the room as he spotted me. "I can't tell you how much this means to me. I've missed you so much, son." He approached with arms extended for a hug, clearly performing for the audience of relatives who had been fed his victim narrative for 3 years. I accepted the embrace while fighting every instinct to pull away. "It's good to see you too, David," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Patricia glided over with a smile that seemed genuine until you looked at her eyes. "Artemis, you've grown into such a handsome young man. David talks about you constantly. We've both been praying for this day." "I appreciate that, Patricia. I know this situation has been difficult for everyone." "The important thing is that family is together again," Margaret interjected, beaming with satisfaction. "Emma is so excited that Uncle David could make it to her party." Sarah approached with Emma in tow. "Emma, look who came to your party. This is your Uncle Artemis and this is his friend Michael." Emma looked up at Michael with curiosity. "Are you my uncle too?" "Actually," Michael said gently, "I'm your cousin. David is my father too, but I haven't seen him in a very long time." The effect of Michael's words on the room was immediate and electric. David's face went completely white, and Patricia's smile froze in place. The relatives who had been chatting comfortably suddenly focused their attention on this unexpected development. "I'm sorry," David said slowly, "but I think there's been some mistake. I don't know who you are." "My name is Michael Patterson," Michael replied calmly. "You married my mother Carol in 1997. You left us when I was 13 years old after emptying our bank accounts. I've been looking for you ever since." The silence in the room was deafening. I could see relatives exchanging glances, trying to process this information. David was clearly struggling to maintain his composure while calculating how to respond. "Young man," Patricia said with forced cheerfulness, "I think you're confused. David was married to Linda before we got together. There wasn't anyone before Linda." "Actually, there was," Michael said, pulling out a manila folder. "I have the marriage certificate, divorce papers, and financial records showing how David systematically stole our family's savings before abandoning us." Tom stepped forward, his business-oriented mind immediately focusing on the practical implications. "David, is this true? Were you married before Linda?" David's performance was impressive in its desperation. His eyes filled with tears, and his voice became shaky with emotion. This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. Linda has been spreading lies about me for years, and now she's convinced other people to harass me at family gatherings. David, I said quietly, Michael has never spoken to my mother. He found you through his own investigation. That's impossible. This is all part of Linda's revenge campaign against me. She must have hired this person to disrupt any chance we had at reconciliation. Patricia jumped in to support David's narrative. Linda has been absolutely vicious in trying to turn people against David. She's even tried to have him arrested on false charges. What false charges? Jake asked, speaking for the first time since Michael's revelation. Fraud allegations related to their divorce, Patricia said smoothly. Linda claimed David hid assets, but the courts found no evidence of wrongdoing. She's been trying to destroy his reputation ever since. Margaret looked confused and distressed, but Linda seemed so nice when they were married. I can't imagine her being vindictive enough to hire someone to impersonate David's son. Mental illness can make people do terrible things, Patricia replied with practiced sympathy. David tried to get Linda help for years, but she refused treatment. The gambling addiction made her paranoid and desperate. I realized this was the moment we'd been preparing for. David and Patricia were doubling down on their lies, repeating the false narrative about Linda's supposed gambling and mental health problems in front of the entire family. Patricia. I said, can you be more specific about Mom's gambling problem? When did it start, and where did she go to gamble? Well, Patricia began, clearly comfortable with this topic. Linda was addicted to casino gambling primarily. She would disappear for hours at a time, claiming she was working extra shifts. But David discovered she was actually at the casinos. She also had problems with online gambling, running up huge debts on credit cards David didn't know about. Tom nodded sympathetically. That explains why David had to take control of their finances. He was trying to protect the family from Linda's addiction. Exactly, Patricia continued. David tried interventions counseling, even threatening divorce if Linda didn't get help, but she was in complete denial about the extent of her problem. Jake had been quietly observing this exchange while positioning himself near the door to prevent David and Patricia from leaving if they realized they were being exposed. Now he spoke up. Patricia, it's interesting that you know so much detail about Linda's supposed gambling problem. How did you learn all these specifics? Lunch may I? David told me everything during our courtship. He was still traumatized by what Linda had put him through. He needed someone who understood the depth of her betrayal. And you believed these stories without ever meeting Linda or seeing any evidence? Patricia's expression flickered with annoyance at Jake's questions. I saw the financial records from their divorce. I saw the credit card statements and the evidence of Linda's secret spending. David showed me everything. Did you see actual casino receipts or gambling transaction records? I saw enough evidence to understand that Linda had serious problems that she refused to address. Margaret was becoming uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Jake, why are you interrogating Patricia? She's just explaining what David went through. Because, Jake said, reaching into his jacket for the folder of documents we'd prepared, I've seen the actual financial records from David and Linda's divorce, and they tell a completely different story. He handed Margaret copies of the court documents showing David's asset hiding and financial manipulation. These are official records from their divorce proceedings. They show that David opened secret accounts, took loans against their house without Linda's knowledge, and moved money into accounts controlled by Patricia before the divorce was finalized. Margaret stared at the documents with growing confusion. But this says David was the one hiding money. This says Linda tried to stop him from transferring their assets. Because that's what actually happened, I said. David and Patricia have been lying about everything for 3 years. David's emotional performance intensified. Those documents are fabricated. Linda's attorney created false evidence to support her accusations. I've been fighting these lies in court ever since. Then you should be happy to know, Michael said, opening his own folder, that I have identical financial records from your divorce from my mother 25 years ago. The pattern is exactly the same. secret accounts, hidden assets, and sudden disappearance after stealing everything valuable. He handed the documents to Tom, who began comparing the financial patterns between David's two divorces. The similarities were unmistakable and damning. "David," Tom said slowly, "these records show you used the same techniques to steal from both families. How do you explain that?" "It's all lies," Patricia shrieked, her composure finally cracking. "You people are ganging up on David based on forged documents and false accusations. This is exactly the kind of harassment we've been dealing with for years." Emma started crying at Patricia's raised voice, and Sarah quickly took her daughter to another room to shield her from the adult conflict erupting around her birthday celebration. "Patricia," I said, reaching for my phone to start recording, "if these are all lies, then you should have no problem explaining why you told Margaret that David has been sending me birthday cards and Christmas gifts that were returned unopened. Because it's true, David has tried dozens of times to reach out to you, but Linda intercepts everything. David doesn't have my address or phone number. He's never attempted to contact me in 3 years. That's because Linda told him you never wanted to see him again." "When did Linda tell him that?" Patricia realized she'd created a logical contradiction. If David had been trying to send gifts and cards, he would have needed to contact me directly to get my address. If Linda had told him I never wanted to see him again, there would have been no reason for him to attempt contact. "You're twisting everything," Patricia said desperately. "You're making it impossible to have a rational conversation about healing this family." "The only healing this family needs," Michael said firmly, "is protection from a career criminal who has been destroying lives for decades." David finally abandoned his emotional victim act and revealed the cold calculation underneath. "I don't know who you people think you are, but you're not going to destroy my relationship with my family based on these ridiculous accusations." "Your family?" I asked. "David, you abandoned Michael's family 15 years ago. You destroyed my mother's life through systematic financial abuse. What exactly makes you think you have a family to destroy? These people care about me." David gestured toward Margaret and Tom, who were still studying the financial documents. "They understand that bitter ex-wives and confused children can't be trusted to tell the truth about complicated situations." But Margaret and Tom were no longer nodding sympathetically. The documentary evidence was too clear and consistent to dismiss as coincidence or fabrication. "David," Margaret said quietly, "if Michael is really your son from a previous marriage, why didn't you ever tell us about him?" For the first time since Michael's arrival, David had no ready answer. His lies had been constructed around the assumption that his family history before Linda would never be revealed. The room fell silent as everyone waited for David's explanation of how he'd forgotten to mention having another son. David's silence stretched for nearly a minute as he struggled to construct an explanation for Michael's existence that wouldn't completely destroy his credibility. Finally, he attempted a new version of his victim narrative. "Michael was part of a very painful chapter in my life that I've tried to put behind me. His mother, Carol, was unstable, much like Linda became later. I had to leave that situation for my own safety and sanity." "You had to leave your 13-year-old son for your own safety?" Margaret asked incredulously. "Carol was using Michael to manipulate me emotionally. She threatened to turn him against me if I didn't give her everything she wanted in the divorce. I thought it would be better for Michael if I removed myself from that toxic situation." Michael's laugh was bitter and painful to hear. "You didn't remove yourself from anything. You cleaned out our bank accounts in the middle of the night and disappeared without saying goodbye. Mom woke up to find a note saying you needed a fresh start." "That's not how it happened," David insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your mother has distorted your memories of that time." "I still have the note you left," Michael said, reaching into his folder again. "Would you like me to read it to everyone?" David's face went ashen as Michael unfolded a piece of paper that had clearly been handled many times over the years. "David," Margaret said, "let him read the note. If it's not what Michael claims, this will clear up the confusion." Michael's voice was steady as he read his father's own words. "Carol, I can't do this anymore. I need to start over somewhere new without the constant stress and drama. I've taken what I need to get established elsewhere. Don't try to find me. This is better for everyone, especially Michael. He deserves a more stable environment than I can provide right now. Tell him I'm sorry." The impact on the relatives was devastating. David's own written words contradicted every element of his current narrative. He hadn't left to protect anyone. He had abandoned his family for his own convenience, stealing their savings in the process. Tom was staring at David with a mixture of disgust and recognition. "The legal fees you asked me for money to pay, were those related to Carol's family trying to find you?" "Tom, that's a completely different situation," David began, but his protests were losing their effectiveness. "Are they?" Jake interrupted, pulling out his own documentation. "Because I've been tracking the money that family members have loaned you over the past 2 years, and it adds up to over $20,000, none of which has been repaid." He began reading from a list he'd compiled. "Tom, you gave David $1,500 for legal fees. Margaret, you gave him $800 for Patricia's mother's medical bills. Sarah gave him $3,000 for ongoing legal expenses related to fighting Linda's false accusations. Don't forget Uncle Bill," I added, referring to David's older brother who lived in Colorado Springs. "He mentioned loaning David money for car repairs last Christmas." Margaret looked stricken. "David, you told me Patricia's mother was dying and needed surgery. You said your insurance wouldn't cover everything." "She did need medical care," Patricia said defensively. "David was trying to help my family during a crisis." "Your mother lives in Florida," Jake said. "I checked. She's alive and healthy and has no idea that you've been telling people she needed expensive medical treatment." Patricia's face flushed red. "You had no right to investigate my family." "I had every right to protect my family from fraud," Jake replied. "And that's exactly what you and David have been committing. Systematic fraud against people who trusted you." Tom's business background made him focus on the financial implications. "David, if you needed money for legitimate expenses, why didn't you just ask for help directly, instead of creating different cover stories for each person?" "Because you wouldn't have understood the complexity of the legal situation," David said weakly. "Try me," Tom challenged. "Explain the legal situation that required $20,000 from multiple family members while you were taking vacations to Hawaii." David's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. There was no explanation that could reconcile their supposed financial struggles with their obvious expenditures on luxury items and travel. Patricia tried to salvage their position by going on the offensive. "You people are horrible. David is trying to rebuild his relationship with his son, and you're attacking him with ancient history and twisted interpretations of normal family financial arrangements." "Normal family financial arrangements don't involve lying about dying relatives," Margaret said coldly. Her transformation from sympathetic supporter to disgusted critic was complete. "And they don't involve abandoning children and cleaning out bank accounts," Michael added. "I want my money back," Tom said suddenly. "All of it. If you can afford vacations, you can afford to repay your debts to family members." "That money was a gift to help family during a crisis," David protested. "No, it was a loan based on lies about legal fees that don't exist. That makes it fraud." Sarah returned from settling Emma in her bedroom where the little girl could finish her birthday celebration away from the adult conflict. "I heard voices raised. Is everything all right?" "I said gently. We've been explaining to David and Patricia that the family knows about their lies regarding the money they've borrowed and the stories they've told about Mom." "Oh," Sarah said quietly. "So everyone knows about the $3,000 I gave them for legal fees." "You gave them $3,000, Margaret gasped. "Sarah, you're raising Emma alone on a nurse's salary. You can't afford to give away that kind of money." "Patricia convinced me that David would pay everyone back once his legal battles with Linda were resolved," Sarah explained. "She said it was temporary help during a family crisis." Patricia's desperation was becoming more apparent as she realized their web of lies was unraveling completely. "Sarah volunteered that money. We never demanded anything from anyone. People offered to help because they understood what David was going through. People offered to help because you created fictional emergencies and told them their assistance was needed temporarily." Jake corrected. That's called confidence fraud. This is insane, Patricia shrieked. You're twisting generous family support into some kind of criminal conspiracy. Actually, I said, pulling out the final piece of evidence I'd been saving, let's talk about actual criminal conspiracies. Patricia, how is the audit going at the nonprofit where you work? The color drained from Patricia's face so quickly I thought she might faint. What audit? Margaret asked. The state attorney general's office is investigating approximately $30,000 in missing funds from the nonprofit that provides meals to elderly residents. I explained. Patricia is the treasurer of that organization. That's confidential information, Patricia shouted. You have no right to discuss my employment situation. It stopped being confidential when it became a criminal investigation, I replied. And it stopped being just your employment situation when you started stealing money from elderly people who depend on that organization for food. Tom was staring at Patricia with horror. You've been embezzling from a charity that feeds old people. The investigation is ongoing, Patricia said desperately. Nothing has been proven. These are just accounting discrepancies that have reasonable explanations. Reasonable explanations like $30,000 in phantom vendor payments and false expense reports, I asked. Margaret stood up from her chair, her face filled with disgust. Get out of my family, both of you. Get out right now. Margaret, please. David tried one more emotional manipulation. Don't let them destroy our relationship with lies and jealousy. You know me. You know I would never hurt anyone. I thought I knew you, Margaret replied. But the man I thought I knew wouldn't abandon a 13-year-old child, steal from 2 different wives, defraud his own family members, and marry someone who steals from starving elderly people. Everything you've heard tonight is lies and distortions, David shouted, finally dropping any pretense of calm reasonableness. These people have poisoned your minds against me. No, David, Tom said firmly. You've poisoned our minds against you with your own actions. The evidence speaks for itself. Patricia made one final attempt to control the situation by threatening the family. If you people continue this harassment campaign against us, we'll take legal action. We'll sue everyone in this room for defamation and conspiracy. Please do, Jake said calmly. It will give us an opportunity to present all our evidence in court, including the documentation of your embezzlement and David's pattern of fraud across multiple states. Multiple states? Sarah asked. Patricia and David have been operating in Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado that we know of, I explained. They've been targeting communities through churches and civic organizations, building credibility and then systematically exploiting people's trust. The scope of David and Patricia's criminal activities was finally becoming clear to the family. This wasn't just a case of family dysfunction or financial irresponsibility. They were professional criminals who had been using family relationships as cover for decades of fraud. I'm calling the police, Margaret announced, reaching for her phone. You can't prove anything, Patricia screamed, her composure completely shattered. Everything you have is circumstantial evidence and hearsay. Actually, a new voice said from the doorway, we can prove quite a lot. Everyone turned to see a woman in her 50s standing in Sarah's entrance hall. She was well-dressed but tired-looking, with the kind of weariness that comes from years of fighting difficult battles. Mom, Michael said in surprise. What are you doing here? I drove up to support you, Carol replied, and I brought a friend from the Attorney General's office who has been very interested in meeting Patricia and David. A man in a business suit stepped into view beside Carol. Good evening. I'm Detective Rodriguez with the Colorado Attorney General's White-Collar Crime Unit. Patricia Wilson, you're under arrest for embezzlement and fraud. Patricia's scream of rage and despair echoed through the house as Detective Rodriguez began reading her Miranda rights. David stood frozen as he watched his partner in crime being handcuffed, finally understanding that their years of manipulation had caught up with them. David Patterson. Detective Rodriguez continued, you're also under arrest as an accessory to fraud and for violation of multiple court orders related to asset concealment. As the handcuffs clicked around David's wrists, he looked directly at me with an expression of pure hatred that revealed his true nature more clearly than any evidence could. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Family is family and blood is thicker than water." "You're right," I replied calmly. "Family is family. That's why Michael and I are going to make sure you never have the opportunity to destroy another family again." 6 months later, I stood in Sarah's backyard watching Emma play with the new swing set that Jake and I had installed for her 9th birthday party. This celebration was everything her previous party should have been. Genuine, joyful, and free from manipulation. Patricia had been sentenced to 4 years in prison for embezzlement and fraud. The evidence against her was overwhelming once investigators gained access to her financial records and discovered the sophisticated shell company systems she and David had used to hide their stolen assets across multiple states. David received 6 years for his role as an accessory and for violating multiple court orders related to asset concealment during his divorce from Mom. More importantly, his conviction opened the door for Carol and Mom to file civil suits that recovered most of their stolen marital assets. The extended family had rallied around Mom in a way that brought tears to my eyes. Margaret organized a fund to help Mom pay for the additional nursing education she'd always wanted but couldn't afford. Tom used his business connections to help her find a higher-paying position at a private medical practice. Uncle Bill drove down from Colorado Springs every few weeks to help with home maintenance projects. "The family owes Linda a debt we can never fully repay," Margaret had told me. "We supported her abuser for 3 years because we believed his lies. The least we can do is support her recovery now." Michael had moved to Denver and was working as a project manager for a construction company. Having a brother who understood the specific trauma of David's abandonment had been healing for both of us. We talked regularly about our experiences and our ongoing efforts to break the cycle of manipulation in our lives. "The weird thing is that I'm grateful David led me to you," Michael had said recently. "I spent 15 years wondering if I had any family left. Now I have a brother and Aunt Linda who treats me like a son and a whole extended family that actually functions like a family should." Carol had become close friends with Mom, bonded by their shared experience of surviving David's systematic abuse. They met for coffee every week and had started a support group for women who had experienced financial abuse in marriage. "It's remarkable how much stronger you feel when you realize you weren't the only target," Mom told me. "For years I thought I was crazy or weak because I couldn't see through David's manipulation. Now I understand that he was a professional who had spent decades perfecting his techniques." The most satisfying development had been watching the family adapt new communication patterns designed to prevent future manipulation. Jake had suggested that any request for financial assistance from family members be discussed openly with at least 2 other relatives before any money changed hands. "It's not that we don't trust each other," he explained. "It's that we've learned how skilled manipulators can exploit individual relationships while avoiding group scrutiny." Sarah had recovered the $3,000 she'd given David and Patricia thanks to asset forfeiture proceeds from their criminal convictions. More importantly, she had learned to trust her instincts about people who made her feel pressured or guilty about family obligations. The biggest lesson for me was understanding that genuine family members don't put you in situations where you have to choose between your financial security and family loyalty, she reflected. Real family members want what's best for you, not what's best for themselves. As I watched Emma laugh while her mother pushed her on the new swing, I thought about the life lesson that had emerged from our painful confrontation with David and Patricia. Sometimes protecting family means exposing the people who are destroying it from within. For years, I'd felt guilty about cutting contact with David, wondering if I was being too harsh or if I should try harder to maintain family relationships. The discovery of his criminal activities taught me that my instincts had been correct. Some people are genuinely dangerous, and removing them from your life isn't cruel or vindictive. It's necessary for survival. But the deeper lesson was about the difference between real family and people who simply share your DNA. Real family members support each other through difficulties without creating those difficulties themselves. They celebrate your successes without trying to profit from them. They respect your boundaries instead of constantly testing them. David had spent decades claiming family status while systematically betraying family values. Patricia had wrapped herself in the language of healing and reconciliation while actively harming vulnerable people. Their removal from our lives hadn't damaged our family. It had finally allowed our family to function properly. Margaret approached me as I stood reflecting on the past months. "I owe you an apology that I can never fully express," she said. "I spent 3 years defending a criminal and believing lies about Linda because I wanted to believe that family conflicts could always be resolved with enough love and patience." "You couldn't have known," I told her. "David and Patricia were professionals. They knew exactly how to exploit your desire to believe the best about family members." "But that's just it," she replied. "I think part of me did know, but I ignored my doubts because confronting them would have been too painful. It's easier to believe that family members are good people who make mistakes than to accept that some family members are genuinely harmful people who make deliberate choices to hurt others." "What changed your mind?" "Michael showing up with evidence that David had abandoned a previous family. That couldn't be explained away as misunderstandings or personality conflicts. That was a pattern of deliberate cruelty that had been hidden for decades." Uncle Tom joined our conversation carrying a plate of birthday cake for Emma. "I've been thinking about something David said right before he was arrested. He claimed that blood is thicker than water, as if sharing genetics gave him the right to abuse people without consequences." "What conclusion did you reach?" I asked. "That the actual meaning of family has nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with choice. David chose to abandon Michael, chose to abuse Linda, chose to defraud all of us. We chose to support each other, chose to seek the truth, and chose to protect vulnerable family members from harm. Our choices define us as a family, not our shared DNA." As the afternoon wore on, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent from my life for years. The fear that I'd been too harsh in cutting contact with David was gone, replaced by confidence that protecting myself and Mom from his manipulation had been the right decision. More importantly, I'd learned that real justice isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about ensuring that harmful people can't continue harming others. David and Patricia's arrest hadn't just vindicated our decision to expose them. It had protected future victims from their ongoing criminal enterprises. Carol pulled me aside as the party was winding down. "I want you to know how much it means to Michael and me that you included us in your family. For 15 years, we felt like we were the only people who knew what David was really capable of. Having our experiences validated and our family restored has been life-changing." "What will you do now?" I asked. "Michael and I are working with law enforcement agencies in Arizona and New Mexico to help prosecute David and Patricia's crimes in those states. We're also consulting with victim advocacy organizations to help them recognize the warning signs of systematic family fraud." "Are there other families still struggling with David's legacy?" "At least 2 that we know of. The investigators found evidence that David abandoned families in Texas and Oregon before he moved to Arizona and met my mother. We're hoping that our willingness to come forward will encourage other victims to seek justice." The scope of David's lifetime of family destruction was staggering, but equally impressive was the network of healing and support that had emerged from exposing his crimes. Families that had been isolated and ashamed were connecting with each other, sharing resources and strategies for recovery. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how much my understanding of family responsibility had evolved over the past year. I'd initially felt torn between loyalty to my father and protection of my mother, as if those were competing obligations. Now I understood that real family loyalty means protecting vulnerable family members from harm, even when that harm comes from other family members. Supporting David's access to our family while knowing he was actively harming people wouldn't have been loyalty. It would have been enablement of ongoing abuse. The most profound change was in my relationship with Mom. For 3 years, we'd been united by shared trauma and mutual protection from David's manipulation. Now we were building a relationship based on genuine affection and respect, free from the shadow of ongoing threat. "I'm proud of the man you've become," Mom told me recently. but I'm most proud of your courage to stand up for what's right when standing up was difficult and painful. I learned that courage from watching you survive 15 years of marriage to David, I replied. You never stopped fighting for what was right even when everyone around you believed his lies. 6 months after David and Patricia's arrest, our family had not only recovered from their manipulation, we had become stronger and more connected than we'd ever been before. We had learned to value truth over comfort, justice over false peace, and protection over politeness. Looking back, I realized that David's attempt to use Emma's birthday party for manipulation had backfired completely. Instead of forcing an unwanted reconciliation, his scheme had provided the perfect opportunity to expose his crimes and protect our family from further harm. Sometimes the best defense against manipulation is simply creating space for the truth to emerge. When we stopped protecting David from the consequences of his actions and started protecting ourselves from their impact, justice naturally followed. The birthday party where everything changed had taught us that real family celebrations aren't about maintaining comfortable illusions. They're about honoring the people we choose to love and protecting them from those who would do them harm. As I pulled into my driveway, I smiled, thinking about Emma's genuine joy during her second birthday celebration. This time there had been no hidden agendas, no emotional manipulation, no adults using a child's special day to advance their own destructive purposes. It was exactly what a family gathering should be: honest, supportive, and filled with people who genuinely cared about each other's well-being. That's the kind of family worth fighting to protect. Before I end this story, I want to ask you something that's been on my mind throughout this entire experience. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between keeping peace in your family and protecting someone you love from harm? How did you handle the pressure to maintain relationships with people who were actively hurting others just because they were family? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. These situations are more common than we often realize, and sharing our stories can help others who might be facing similar dilemmas. If this story resonated with you, please consider hitting the like button to help others find it. Subscribe for more real-life stories about family challenges and the courage it takes to overcome them. And please share this with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the difference between real family loyalty and enabling harmful behavior. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of a community that values truth, justice, and genuine family connection. I hope you and your loved ones stay safe. Stay strong and never hesitate to protect each other from those who would do you harm, regardless of their relationship to you. Take care, and remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refusing to let toxic people destroy it from within.